In today's podcast, I'll talk about margarine, a product that is part of our everyday lives because it has always been available in grocery stores. Hi, welcome back to Olive Oil Drops, a podcast created by Marco Antonucci. For all of you who want to know everything or almost everything about olive oil and olives, I'm Milena. So, what is margarine? Simply put it is a fat, a lipid that is solid at room temperature. Margarine is a water in oil emulsion made from vegetable or animal fats through a process called hydrogenation, along with the use of special additives. Ingredients like emulsifiers, salt, skim milk, whey, coloring, preservatives, and flavors can be added to this emulsion to stabilize and enhance the final product. Margarine was invented in France at the end of the 19th century by a French chemist, Hippolyte Mejmourier. He initially called it oleomargarine, combining the words oil and margaric. The term margaric refers to margaric acid, which was discovered at the beginning of the 19th century by another French chemist who named it margaric because the droplets reminded him of shiny pearls. Now, the Greek word for pearl is margaritari. In the late 1860s, there was a need for cheaper butter substitute that could be stored longer, even at room temperature, without going rancid and could be used to feed French troops. The margarine created by Mejmourier was quite different from today's margarine. Essentially, what he did, he mixed beef fat with sour milk. Initially, margarine was not well received because it was produced industrially through a crystallization process, unlike natural butter. Though margarine had a texture similar to butter, it had an unappealing whitish color. However, when color was added during production, it gained a buttery yellow hue. Margarine quickly became popular in the United States in the late 19th century, but it was a deceptive business rife with counterfeiters. By 1902, legislation was passed to prohibit the addition of color during production process because it misled consumers by making margarine look like butter. And what did the industry do in response? Well, margarine companies began distributing their product with a package of yellow food coloring. The economic crisis of 1929, combined with margarine's low cost, ease of storage, and replacement of animal fats with vegetable oils, naturally boosted sales. As a result, margarine became widely consumed in America and around the world until a few years ago when butter consumption began to rise again, reducing margarine's popularity. What's in margarine? Today, the raw materials used for the fat content in margarine, which makes up approximately 80 to 85% of the product, are primarily vegetable-based. These include oils from sunflower, soybean, palm, coconut, peanut, and olive. Animal fats such as pork lard, beef or sheep tallow, and fish oil are rarely used. When they are mixed with vegetable oils and almost always for industrial purposes. The types of lipids used in margarine can be categorized into saturated fats. These typically belong to the glycerol esters class of palmitic acid C16, margaric acid C17, and stearic acid C18, which, as you can tell by numbers, have very long carboxyl chains. And mono and polyunsaturated fats. These include oils such as soybean, sunflower, flax, corn, canola, and olive. However, simply mixing these fatty acids won't result in a solid product. At most, you would get a very dense liquid at room temperature. What determines the firmness and melting point of margarine is the degree of saturation of the fats used and their proportion in the mixture. The more saturated fats are, the more they contribute to the crystallization of the product, making it more solid. Lard, which is the saturated fat par excellence, is a clear example of this. On the other hand, the more unsaturated fats are, the more liquid they remain. Extra virgin olive oil and other oils with a high unsaturated component illustrate this. Saturated fats tend to crystallize at higher temperatures. Well, you can verify this by placing several samples of oil in the fridge. The first to crystallize will be those with a high saturated fat content, as these fats have higher crystallization temperatures. Since margarine appears solid at room temperature, one might assume that it contains a high amount of saturated fats. However, the reality is that the solid lipid fraction of margarine increasingly relies on fats that are not naturally saturated. This shift is due to the negative health impacts of saturated fats, including their contribution to elevated blood cholesterol levels, the formation of atherosclerotic plaques, and other adverse effects from their accumulation in the body. Instead, unsaturated vegetable oils are used, which are made saturated through the chemical process of hydrogenating the double bonds present between some of the carbon atoms in the fatty acid chain. This is done using a catalytic process that generally involves a high temperature, high pressure reaction of hydrogen gas with nickel. Why should it be avoided? But basically, during the hydrogenating step, a good portion of unsaturated fats become saturated, causing them to become solid and have a higher melting point. However, the high temperatures used in hydrogenation tend to flip some of the unsaturated fatty acids from the isomeric cis form, the natural form of fats, into the trans form, which is not only unnatural, but also spatially bulkier from the cis form. This leads to significant issues in cholesterol metabolism. Cholesterol in the blood isn't transported freely, but rather bound to lipoproteins. When the lipid part of these lipoproteins contains trans fatty acids, as well as long-chain saturated fats, which also have a negative impact, it causes the molecules to become bulkier. This promotes the deposition of cholesterol on the walls of blood vessels, raising the level of LDL, low-density lipoprotein, known as the bad lipoproteins responsible for cholesterol transport. Furthermore, the human body perceives these fatty acids as saturated, although their original nature is unsaturated, leading to a sort of identity crisis. Consequently, trans fatty acids pose greater health risks than genuine saturated fats. It is futile, or rather harmful, to consume margarine made from olive oil through hydrogenation. During the process of creating hydrogenated margarine, saturated oils are mixed and heated until they surpass the melting point around 50 degrees Celsius, ensuring they blend evenly. Then water is added and dispersed, forming very fine droplets with the help of emulsifying agents that reduce the surface tension between water and oil. The subsequent crystallization process is the most delicate stage because it determines the final physical state of the product. As I mentioned, oils solidify at different temperatures, transitioning from an alpha-type crystalline form to beta-type form. Now, these beta crystals are so tiny that they can incorporate even the liquid part of the oil, giving the margarine a shiny, velvety texture. This process is facilitated by using a cool cylinder with special paddles, which slowly process and blend the margarine. It looks very much like an ice cream maker. Commercially available margarine typically appears bright yellow because dyes are added to mimic the color of butter. Additionally, its taste is enhanced by the inclusion of chemical additives which make it more palatable than its original flavor. Common additives include also salt, food preservatives, vitamins, acidity correctors, and flavorings. This industrial process, typical for margarine production, involves the saturation of unsaturated fatty acids. While there are various other methods used in margarine production, they all fundamentally involve this saturation process. What about margarines without hydrogenated fats? It is true that more and more margarines without hydrogenated fats are appearing on the market, especially for home use. But are they any better for you? And how are they made? Well, in simple terms, they start with generic vegetable oils, discarding the least harmful part and keeping the rest, which happens to be the worst for health. Instead of hydrogenation, these margarines undergo fractionation, a physical process that uses temperature and pressure without chemicals. This method is also used for producing fractionated oils. Fractionation separates the solid, saturated part, which has low perishability and remains solid at room temperature, from the vegetable oils. Through a few steps, this separated part is then made suitable for preparing non-hydrogenated margarine. In essence, only the least healthy part of vegetable oils is retained for non-hydrogenated margarine, while the portion containing polyunsaturated fats considered beneficial for health is eliminated. So the only advantage of non-hydrogenated margarine over hydrogenated margarine is the absence of trans fats. Is it possible to make it at home? Yes. This is a product that can be easily replicated in one's own kitchen without the need for complex chemistry. If you want to find out how, please tune in again in 2 weeks' time. And if instead you wish to ask us questions, you can do so either by email, oliveoildrops@gmail.com, website www.oliveoildrops.com, where you can also find the text of this podcast both in English and Italian, or podcast platform to which you can subscribe free of charge. Thank you for joining us today.